So I'm very pleased to have on the line Sean Adams, and we're going to have a conversation a little bit about Sean's life and work, and which happily coincides with some of the things that we do and think about at church. And I know some of you will know Sean, and you'll have met him, you'll have met his family, but I don't want to take anything for granted. So I'm going to give Sean the chance to introduce himself briefly. And if you could tell us just briefly who you are and what is it, what do you do? What is your job?
Hi, Tim. Thanks for having me. My name is Sean Adams, and I'm a senior lecturer in New Testament and Ancient Culture at the University of Glasgow. I've been there for 6 years now, and I spend most of my days teaching both undergraduate up to doctoral students. I do some research, and I also train Church of Scotland candidates for ministry.
Okay, and what was it that, first of all, how did you end up in Glasgow, and then how did you end up spending your working life in this very particular area of research and teaching? What were the steps that got you to where you are now?
Yeah, so coming to Glasgow, I did my PhD at Edinburgh, and before that I had done my master's degrees and undergraduate degrees at McMaster University in my hometown of Hamilton, Ontario in Canada. After my PhD, I was fortunate to get a postdoc from the British Academy, which I held at Edinburgh. And then this job came up and I came over. I came here not because I knew much about Glasgow, but they did have a very illustrious history of biblical studies from John Barclay recently, but also Barclay of older years and a bunch of other scholars who've just done a really great job. I got into this initially. I did some youth work back when I was in Canada, when I was doing my undergraduate, and I thought, well, maybe I'd train for ministry. And so I went to the seminary there, and during my first year, I realized that I just loved the study of the Bible. I just really enjoyed, much to my surprise, the study of languages, learning ancient Greek and Hebrew, learning about the ancient world. I always liked history, but it was just really exciting for me. I really liked the teaching and the writing aspect. So after my first year of my MDiv, I finished my MDiv and then I continued on to do the more academic track, so to do my PhD.
Question. Tell me one thing that excites you about your current role of research.
I actually really enjoy a lot of what I do at the university. I enjoy teaching. I find it really engaging and really exciting talking to students and other, both those who are just first year, but also those who are doctoral. Those people are just really excited about what they do. I really love the research. I love studying and trying to understand and find answers to questions, and the camaraderie that happens both here, but also in the UK and broader across the world, about people joining together to try to find answers and explore their passion. I also really enjoy an element of my job, which is training of ministers. Having done ministry and trained for ministry, I really find a sense of calling in that I want to be able to help them do their job better and to be able to handle scripture well for whatever they want to actually do in their career.
Great. Okay, well, we're now going to narrow it down a bit, and at the moment on Sundays we're looking at one part of one of Paul's letters, 1 Corinthians, and so just to get us thinking about Paul, who didn't just write that letter, but obviously wrote a good part of the New Testament, and just tease out for us, who was Paul, and if we know anything about him, how do we know what we know? What are our sources?
Yeah. So Paul, as we have gotten to know him, is a leading figure of the early Christian movement. His texts that we have in the New Testament, 13 are attributed to him, and they are the oldest texts that we have from the Christian movement, so the earliest written Christian texts that have survived. They are really interesting in the sense that we get a sense of both what Paul is trying to do, engage with different Christian communities across the Mediterranean, but also a bit about himself, about his role within the developing church. From those letters, as well as the book of Acts, which is a story about the early Christians following Jesus's ascension. It's not just about Paul, but the last half is about Paul, and Paul's prominent there. We can start to piece together a semblance about his life, his missionary journeys, who he was engaging with, where he went. And there's also other texts that have been attributed or talk about Paul that didn't make into the canon, that talk about his death and how he died and some of his other exploits. So all of these data points we kind of bring together to try to understand who Paul was, what he was doing. And it's clear that he was very well educated, both in Hebrew and Greek, that he was a leader within the Jewish church, within Judaism, and that upon his understanding of who Jesus was, became a leader within the Christ movement, within Judaism, and that he was also instrumental in bringing that Jewish Messiah to Gentiles, people who are outside of the Jewish movement.
And I mean, part of what we're doing at the moment at church, and churches throughout the history of the Christian church have done, is it's pour over these letters written under Paul's name and have looked to them as part of Scripture. I mean, what is the particular significance and contribution of his letters? What do they give us that we otherwise might not have?
Yeah, I think there are many different contributions to his letters. First of all, like I was saying, is the historical element for us to understand how did the earliest Christ followers go from Easter Sunday to what we actually know of now as a church, or where the church has grown into over the last 2 millennia. Understanding the first kind of events and the first individuals who shape that, I think, can be really vital for us and our understanding. So we have a historical element that is really vital. But even more so, the theological elements. These texts are about God, are about our relationship with God, who Jesus is, who Jesus is in relationship to God and what he's done for us. All of these elements are essential for us as a church for how we live and how we understand and how we kind of engage with the world around us. And so I think both of those are really vital for us for how we do that. And it's clear that Paul and the Corinthians and other people were wrestling with those questions as well.
I mean, I find as I move between different parts of the Bible, I sometimes find it quite jarring if I've been reading for a while through one part of the Bible, it's in a certain genre, a certain style, and then I come to another part, and sometimes it feels easier or harder. And as we read Paul's letters, what are the particular things that we need to bear in mind? What are the challenges if we're to actually read it well and get a true sense of what he intended when he wrote it, what it might mean for us, so that we don't get caught up with confused ideas or just completely stuck?
Yeah, there are lots of different ways to read Paul's letters. For myself, I'm very much interested in, and I think it's really important for us to understand the author and the original intention of the letter. So for us to understand what Paul was trying to do and what he wasn't trying to do. And I think that can be some constraint to how we read the text and apply it to our understanding. These texts that we have that were collected in the Bible, Paul's letters are letters. They were written at a specific point in time from an individual or a few people to a church at a specific location. And that church was struggling with certain issues. They were sometimes they had questions they needed answered. They might have been actually going in the wrong direction according to what Paul was thinking about where they should go. So correction might need to be had, say, Galatians. But Also, these are texts that show that there is a previous relationship between Paul and those individuals. Paul was there at some point in time. Timothy and others had been there. There had been teaching already. And so part of these letters have a foundation of previous relationship that was already there. These letters are designed not to be theological treatises covering all points of doctrine, but to actually address specific needs that were being felt by the individuals, both Paul and the Corinthians, his recipients. So for me, that I think that's really important as an initial case. These texts are historically grounded and that they were written for a particular purpose. When we read them today, we might ask, we have different questions, but we also have some of the same questions. Sometimes the questions we ask of the text, Paul wasn't trying to address. So it might not be the fairest of questions. One of the challenges for us when we develop our own theology and for the church, but also individually, is how we take individual statements from Paul that were historically grounded and understand how they might be relevant or practicable for today. Is it a one-to-one correlation? Do we have to change it because of our culture and our different understanding of human rights or these kind of elements? So there's lots of debate, and so it's not a simple project to be able to read a text and create theology. So for me, one of the things I find with my students, especially my first-year students, is that they have sometimes a very simplistic way of reading a text. Oh, this is what the text says, so therefore. And my job in a lot of ways is to help them slow down and understand the assumptions they're making of the text, and to help them make it probably a little more complex, but also enrich it with understanding that how they know what they're doing. And so therefore they can actually talk about it in a very sophisticated manner.
Brilliant, thanks. And we're going to narrow it again now and just talk a wee bit about 1 Corinthians, because that's what we're looking at the moment. And so this letter written by Paul, we've heard a bit about him, to Christian believers in the city of Corinth. What do we know about Corinth? What kind of a place was that? What's the background there, if we're thinking about the time that Paul was writing the letter?
Yeah, so Corinth is a city in Greece. You can go there, you can see the ruins. But it would be a mistake to think that it is actually a Greek city at the time in which Paul's writing. So 164, the Macedonian Wars, that city of Corinth was destroyed, and it was later refounded by the Romans as a Roman colony. So this is where a place where many of the ex-soldiers who fought would be given land. It was very much a Roman city. Very importantly, the geographic location of the city, there's an isthmus there that's kind of a narrowing of the land, and they have ports on either side, and it was a very lucrative town. There was lots of trade because boats would come in on one side and they would leave on the other, and it would save a lot of journeying by sea and what is dangerous sea. So it was a very important port city, and it became very wealthy. Within that world of wealth, there is, under our understanding of the ancient world, is of hierarchy and about who's important, what gives you status. Obviously, wealth is one of those. Good birth is another. Education and rhetoric, the ability to influence others, often in politics. All of these became signifiers of wealth and importance. And Corinth was known for having those be very important within that city. Certain cities in the ancient world were known for having certain elements. Athens was really well known for philosophy. Alexandria in Egypt was known for its study and critical reading of texts and its library. And Corinth was known for having lots of money, lots of decadence, lots of indulgence, but also people who are really interested in showing off. And so this is part of the element. And so we can see in Paul's letters, especially some of the first chapters, when Paul is really seems to be struggling with the Corinthian church's desire to be first or to have infighting, or who are you following, or were you wise or be well born. And so you can see how there are elements of the location that Paul's really trying to push back upon.
Yeah, so I would just push that a bit further, that there's all these things that academics have pieced together to give us a picture and a sense of what a place like Corinth would have been like. Lots of us opening up the Bible, we just read the letter as it's there, and we don't really know any of that background, or we maybe have little bits that we picked up from sermons or whatever, or holidays to Greece, whatever it might be. But what are the ways, you've given one example there to do with power and status. How can that kind of research and knowledge unlock or help us to really get into what Paul's saying? Or to put it the other way, if we don't have those bits in place, what's the danger there?
Yeah, I think understanding the historical situatedness of the text can be really helpful. So, for example, when we think of the church in Corinth, what do we assume that looks like? Are we assuming a big building in which a united group, everybody in Corinth is a singular church? Or are there smaller congregations or just groups of Christians that Paul's addressing as the church as a whole? I think that's really important. How is it made up? Is it of rich or poor or both? Is it Jewish or Gentile? Mix? I think it's a combination of all those. But also, who engages with whom? So if we think of, say, the discussion about the Lord's Supper and how one is supposed to treat that, Paul is talking about people who are wealthy and who are not. Where are they? And so you can imagine, where are they sitting? What kind of building are they like? So a really great study of this is by Peter Oakes, reading Romans and Pompeii. It's not about Corinth per se, but he looks at historical Pompeii, which has been preserved from the Vesuvian eruption. And he looks about the average size of somebody's house. What does it look like? And actually, they're very small. There's high density. A rich person would have, a larger space. But even then, there's certain areas that you would have organized. Well, the dining area, well, there's X number of couches. Who gets to be on the couch? Who gets to be served? Who does the serving? And you have all of these questions. And I think that's by understanding that historical nature provides new insight and new expectations about what this text is meaning for the celebration of the Lord's Supper. Another example would be 1 Corinthians 8, which we're talking about what are you eating, and eating meat. For us, meat is very common, right? You can go to the grocery store, it's not too expensive. In antiquity, really only the wealthy got to eat meat frequently. When the general public got to eat meat was on festivals, and those festivals were essentially religious festivals. So one of the struggles is that one of the only times you actually got to eat something that was high status was associated with sacrificing to pagan gods and deities. And that part of the struggle is great. Like, are you going to eat it? Are you not going to eat it? But it's not just, I'm going to give up meat and like today we're going to be good vegans or vegetarians. That was a real luxury item that people were really wanting and in a lot of ways needed. People, especially who are poor, could afford very little food, just their sometimes very subsistence. And this was gift of meat at the festivals. And that was really necessary and really vital for their physical well-being. So it was not just the idea of, oh, do it or not do it. There was actually sometimes a real stiff cost associated with denying yourself meat. and from those. So I think by understanding the ancient world and the world around it, you get kind of new glimpses or insight into kind of what Paul is trying to talk about.
Yeah, thanks. I think that's an interesting example. I think the first time I read those passages about eating meat sacrificed to idols, I imagined these Christians getting kind of seduced into something that was really out there and occult and esoteric and strange, whereas actually that was the normal thing for everyone else. And it was, do we keep being like everyone else and taking part in this festival, or do we step out, which is, yeah.
Yeah, and at what cost? And like, what
Yeah.
does it cost you, especially if you're not well off? You know, these festivals were important for you to be able to get access to food and connecting with other people.
Now, I think for lots of people, First Corinthians is a beautiful passage about love that you often hear at a wedding. It's a very familiar passage about the Lord's Supper that we tend to read almost every time that we have a communion service in church. But actually, it's quite a long letter. It covers a lot of ground. Is there one thing that is particularly interesting or exciting that we should pay attention to, or something that maybe is just a question that you would be interested in opening up and thinking about more for yourself? I don't know.
Yeah, for myself, one of my areas of research is ancient education, and that includes both learning to read and write, but also higher forms of education of rhetoric and philosophy. And I've always been fascinated by 1 Corinthians 1-4 and the first sections about Paul talking about wisdom and foolishness, Paul talking about himself as a fool, being fools of Christ in 1 Corinthians 4, and how those two work. As somebody who trains and studies and wants to know things, there is a sharp critique there. Where's the wise man? Where's the scholar, the knowledgeable person of this age? And I think for myself, that speaks to me in a way that is challenging. How do I continue to do what I do, but at the same time, obviously not fall in a way that Paul warns us not to do so with regard to being puffed up or about knowledge and these kind of elements that actually is a real theme all the way through the letter.
Great. No, thanks for sharing that. And just as a very last thing, I'm conscious that in any area of life these days, if there's something that we don't know or want to find more about, we just bash it into Google or Wikipedia or wherever. And I guess a consequence of the Bible being such a widely read book that when you type in anything related to the Bible, you get this huge ream of material, some of which you quickly realize is probably less than helpful. For people who want to go deeper in their Bible study, are there any simple resources? If you could buy one book or use one website or one tip that's going to avoid things that are totally unhelpful, what would that be?
Yeah, I think for myself, what I encourage my first year students, and I would encourage people to do more broadly, is to buy an introduction to the New Testament or introduction to the Bible as a whole. Those are often done by really excellent scholars, and they have a way of kind of laying it out in a very progressive way, in the sense of they start you off with, they don't assume that much, and they can work you through. I haven't found really great resources online. There are a bunch that are with churches and other stuff, but there are so many that I haven't been able to vet them well. Mm-hmm. And this is where I think, actually buying a used copy of a scholar's introduction to the New Testament that's fairly recent actually can be very helpful in that. And they'll point you to other ones. So a good introduction will be able to say, oh, for more information on letter writing and antiquity, you can go look over here. Or and there's a number that are written from a faith perspective that actually have application associated with it. So it's not just learning the history, but it's also how does this work for the development of theology, and both individually but also corporately.
Brilliant, thanks. And I'm sure
you can also ask people like myself, if you know somebody like Adam, I really appreciate when people ask questions. Happy to help them.
Yeah, and we had talk briefly. There might be a chance where we make this a more interactive thing where people can actually. Well, obviously, in the future, we look forward to that time. We can all just sort of be in the same room, and you can say, "Hey, Sean, let me pick your brains." But in the meantime, we might see if we could create some sort of discussion space online, and we can tease out some of these things a bit more. If this hasn't put you off, but we'll come to that.
Yeah, I'm very sorry.
Anyway, right. Well, I'm going to stop recording there, and we'll see how we go. Well, I should say thank you. Thanks, Sean.
My pleasure. I really enjoyed it.
Having watched back the video of our conversation, I felt I perhaps needed to add a bit more enthusiasm to my note of thanks towards Sean. Sean, we're really grateful that you took time to chat to us through these things. I found it really helpful and really interesting, and I hope others found the same. If you'd be interested in more resources like this involving Sean and perhaps others, please let me know. My email address is tsinclair@churchofscotland.org.uk.